Judith Crane looked me up and down, her voice dripping with contempt. People like you drag down the value of this place. That sentence carved itself into my daughter's memory like a blade. But then I bought the lake right under her nose and said coldly, now it's you and your residents who are no longer welcome. This is the story of how an abuser of power crumbled when the community stopped staying silent. What state are you in, and has your HOA ever played dirty with you? I had tried to arrange this weekend to be just for Amara. She was 14, her eyes always holding a sadness too hard to hide. Ever since her mother passed away from illness, that passing didn't feel like a door slammed shut, but more like a quiet crack spreading through the house, growing wider each day until everything sank into silence. Inside, the air felt heavy, thick enough that even the wind slipping through the window could startle Amara. On the nights she cried softly, I heard every sound, could never find words gentle enough, didn't feel fake. I wanted to take her out, not to run away, but to breathe a different kind of air. Kind without the smell of antiseptic, without the hiss of machines, without the shadows of nurses passing by. I wanted her to hear the soft lapping of water, the rustle of leaves, and if we were lucky, forget just a little the kind of loss no child should have to carry. The old wooden fishing rod still held the scent of her mother's hands, a smell no one else would notice. For Amara, it was as familiar as breath. I wiped the dust of time from it carefully and placed it in her hands as if passing on a piece of memory, the only thing we had left to hold. Amara gave a faint smile, awkward and uncertain, but at least it appeared today. I took it as a small sign, but one full of hope. We arrived at the lake at dawn, just as the sun rose behind the line of distant trees, spilling a pale golden light like diluted honey. The water was still, mirroring the sky like a massive glass sheet touched by mist. Quiet was so complete, we could hear birds calling from the opposite shore and insects shifting in the grass. Amara sat at the edge of the old wooden dock, where the peeling paint revealed faded grain beneath. She cast her line, watching the ripples widen and drift as if they could carry her sorrow away. I stood behind her, silent, watching Amara tilt her head slightly, her long hair lifting in the breeze. The moment was breakingly beautiful. My chest tightened with both love and a wish that time could freeze, just for a while, so she could stay in peace a little longer, untouched by the long nights, haunted by dreams and memories. Then the rod twitched. Amara jumped, her eyes lighting up as a silver-green fish thrashed at the hook. She shouted in delight, a clear sound ringing out into the stillness. I saw life flash back into her gaze, that same light I thought had vanished beneath weeks of sleepless night. I sat beside her, and we both laughed. It wasn't loud or long, but it was enough to make me feel as if pain had never existed. I thought to myself, maybe I was right to choose Lakeside as the place to start over. A small, quiet community with a lake, trees, clean air, and the faint promise of healing. But then, like a cruel joke, the sound of wheels grinding over gravel rang out, cutting through everything. That sound was like a blade slashing across the peaceful scene we had just painted. I turned my head and saw a white golf cart speeding toward us, stopping right at the edge of the lake. Out stepped a woman in her 50s, trim figure, hair so blonde it looked as if every strand had been straightened by sheer force of will. She wore a wrinkle-free polo shirt, soft-soled shoes that still struck the ground with the weight of a hammer. Her face was tense, eyes scanning the area as if sweeping for unwanted existence. I had heard neighbors whisper the name Judith Crane, president of the Homeowners Association, famously known as the Queen of the Rule. But this was my first time facing her direct. No greeting, no hint of friendliness, she marched straight up, her shrill voice slicing through the lake's gentle air. You're violating community regulation. This lake is off limits for fishing. Her voice was ice cold and solid as granite. Amara flinched, her hands trembling around the fishing rod as if holding a banned weapon. I stood up, feeling like I'd just been slapped. I couldn't believe it, and the words burst out. What did you say? This lake was listed as a shared amenity when I bought the house. Judith crossed her arms, her lips curling into a smug, mocking smile. Her gaze pierced through the two of us as if we were nothing more than obstacles blocking her view of the perfectly ordered world she was trying to preserve. I felt anger building in my chest, fought to keep my voice calm, partly out of pride, and partly because Amara was standing beside me. I couldn't let her see her father lose control, yelling like some lunatic, even if every word Judith spoke was grinding down my dignity inch by inch. She didn't stop there. From her shirt pocket, she pulled out a tablet, swiped a few times, and held it up directly in front of me. The screen displayed a paragraph of text that had just been approved less than a month ago. The words glared back, cold and harsh as a sentence from a courtroom. Fishing activity at the community lake is prohibited. Any violations will result in a fine of $500. No room for explanation, no room for grace. Amara turned to look at me, her lips pressed tight, eyes shimmering like the surface of a lake about to break. I looked at her, heart aching at how the bit of innocence that had flickered to life life this morning was now being crushed by a venomous voice. In that moment, I understood that life would not grant us peace so easily. The person standing before us, bearing the title of HOA president, was not simply enforcing rules, but using cheap authority to deny basic humanity. I swallowed hard and looked straight at Judith. She wasn't just fining me over a senseless rule, she was trying to make a point that this place wasn't meant for people like us. The newcomers, the ones trying to find their footing after law. I placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, gently signaling her to reel in the line. She obeyed in silence, saying nothing. I clenched my other hand so tightly that my nails pressed deep into my skin. The smell of damp earth, lake wind, and the cold iron scent of humiliation mingled in the air. I swore I wouldn't let this pass as some casual injustice. Judith Crane had no idea what she had just triggered. A morning that seemed peaceful had become the spark for a quiet storm brewing inside me, and that storm someday would swallow her whole. Judith Crane didn't stop at her sharp remark. She leaned in, holding the gleaming tablet and thrusting it toward my face, as if she had just caught me committing a crime. On the screen was a new document, the headline bold and glaring, Amendment to Community Lake Regulation. My eyes scanned the text quickly, landing on one short sentence that landed like a stone. All fishing activity at the lake is prohibited. Fine, $500. Those cold numbers and letters were no different from a blade stabbing straight into the peaceful morning my daughter and I had shared. I looked up at Judith's face. She gave a faint smile, the kind that said everything without needing words, a smirk of victory. Her eyes looked down on me, condescending, as if schooling someone ignorant. I took a deep breath to stay calm, but the tight hiss in my chest made every word press heavy behind my lip. I knew I wasn't being stopped by any fair rule, but by a fabricated restriction made to serve her own agenda. She glanced sideways at Amara, a glint of coldness in her eye. Newcomers usually don't fit in here. The words drifted out like a breeze, but they carried poison. I could see in that look not disdain for us as new residents, but something deeper, a layer of racial bias, a smug reminder that we didn't belong to her kind, or to the circle of trolls she was guarding. Amara lowered her head, her small shoulders trembling. I saw her bite her lip, fighting back the tears. She had never faced such blatant contempt before, especially not from an adult who was supposed to set an example. I wanted to pull her close, to shield her, but my hand was clenched so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Heat surged through me, but I breathed it back down. I couldn't let Judith see me explode, while my daughter stood there scared doing so would be handing her the win. When was this rule passed? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Judith raised an eyebrow, the thin smile on her lips sharpening. Last month. All residents were notified. Maybe you don't check your email. Her tone was soft, drawing out each word with a sing-song mockery, like she was reciting a nursery rhyme that masked pure contempt. I knew for a fact there had been no such notice in my inbox, and I was certain she knew that too. That smile was anything but kind. It was a blade wrapped in velvet, cutting clean with every word while pretending to be polite. Amara softly said, "But Dad didn't do anything wrong." Her voice trembled, but her words cut fresh into my pride. I tightened my grip on her shoulder, gently signaling her to stay quiet. Judith turned to look at Amara, then back at me, face full of satisfaction. Right or wrong, the rule is written, and here, the rule speaks with my voice. She emphasized each word like a hammer strike, both a warning and a threat. Clenched my teeth so hard I thought they might break. In my head, memories rushed in all at once. The early days of signing the papers for the lakeside home, the flowery promises of a peaceful community, the hope that Amara would grow up somewhere safe. Now all of that was crumbling because of one woman who had draped herself in absolute power. I didn't just feel offended, I felt humiliated by the way she used a sweet smile to drive the knife into someone else. "Do you know the lake is the reason I chose Lakeside?" I said through my teeth, trying to hold on to the last shred of calm. Judith shrugged, her smile indifferent, as if she had just heard something trivial. "You could have chosen somewhere else. Here, we set the standard, and not everyone fits." Her answer was salt in an open wound. She didn't care about the pain of a grieving family, didn't care about the memories this lake carried for us. All she cared about was control and the feeling that she could twist anything beneath her hand. Amara couldn't hold it in tears rolled down her face. I saw her shaking, and the weight of helplessness crushed me. In the eyes of a child that had just glimpsed a spark of hope, there was now only shame. I asked myself, how could an adult, someone who claimed to lead a community, be so cruel as to drive a child to tears out of fear and humiliation? Judith turned away, as if everything had been resolved. "Get the money ready. I'll send you the formal notice. And remember, at Lakeside, rules exist to maintain standards, not to negotiate." She finished speaking, spun around, and stepped back into the golf cart. The engine hummed to life, the wheels grinding against the pavement with a cold finality, leaving the two of us frozen at the lake's edge. Amara turned to me and asked, voice choked, "Dad, why does she hate us so much? We were just fishing." I couldn't find a decent answer, my chest crushed, both from her shame and from the bitter humiliation I had to swallow. I leaned down, wiped the tear from her cheek, but inside me, something else had ignited. Judith Crane had planted the seed of a storm she could not yet imagine. We packed packed up our things, each movement heavy with the weight of disgrace. Amara was silent, her eyes red, and I walked away with every step pounding into the ground with anger. I knew then, from the moment Judith held out that tablet with her syrupy smile, every illusion of a peaceful community had turned to ash. This lake, once the place I wanted to preserve our happiest memories, had become a battlefield between a father and daughter and a woman hiding behind manufactured authority. And I swore, this was a fight I would not lose. When we got home, I rushed straight into the study, opened my laptop, and tore through the inbox. I checked every folder from the inbox to spam, even the tabs I'd never touched. All of it was empty. Not a single notice about the so-called phishing ban Judith Crane had waved in my face. The absence of those numbers on the screen was the invisible slap she had just landed. I hadn't only been insulted by the lake, I'd been deceived in my own home, a place where I'd trusted that rules would be transparent. While I sat frozen in front of the screen, Amara curled into the corner of the room, eyes red. I could hear her holding back sobs. She didn't ask me anything, but her silence said it all. Father had just failed to protect the tiny joy the two of us had shared. I wanted to go to her, hold her, promise her everything would be okay, but my chest was heavy with a bitter truth. Judith Crane had turned a seemingly peaceful morning into a bleeding wound, and she was still out there, smiling as if it were all a joke. I grabbed my phone and opened the community's social media page. Just minutes in, I found the post. Judith standing by the lake, holding a wine glass, mouth stretched in a wide grin. Around her was a group of loyal residents, glasses raised in cheer. On the table, trays of food were piled high, string lights draped across the sky, and instruments propped up right at the water's edge. While my daughter and I were fined $500 for a single rod and a tiny green fish, they were throwing a full-blown party in the same exact spot, their laughter drowning out the waves. Judith's caption read, "A united community, building a prosperous lakeside together." Every word in that caption twisted the knife deeper into my gut. I looked at Amara. She too scrolled through the photos. Her eyes were blank, confused, wounded. I heard her whisper, "So why are they allowed, and we're not?" That question was another stab to the heart. I didn't have an answer. I was asking myself the same thing. This blatant injustice needed no explanation. It screamed for itself. I turned back to the chair, my back stiff. In my mind, the puzzle pieces began to connect into a repulsive. Judith didn't care about the environment, and she wasn't worried about the smell of fish ruining someone's breakfast. The ban wasn't for the community. It was for her wallet. I'd heard vague murmurs from a few neighbors that Judith wanted to buy part of the lake to build a private resort, but I'd dismissed it as gossip. Now I knew the truth. She was clearing the way, scrubbing out every trace of local life to turn the lake into her own playground, where every party was a stage for her circle to show off. Heat rushed to my temples, and I muttered under my breath like a vow, "If she uses rules to step on me, I'll use money to crush her." The dry sound of those words hung in the still room, making Amara lift her head to look at me, as if trying to believe that her father really could do it. I stood up and walked out onto the balcony. The wind from the lake blew in, carrying the damp scent of water and grass, but instead of peace, it made me feel suffocated. Across the lake, the party lights still flickered, music echoing faintly. Judith Crane was raising her glass, laughing with her circle. She thought she had just claimed another win, but what she didn't know was that in this very moment, I had decided to become her final opponent. Amara stepped up beside me and quietly asked, "What are you going to do?" I looked at her. Her eyes were dry, but the fear still flickered behind them. I placed my hand on her shoulder, my voice low but firm. "We'll show her that not everyone lets her dictate everything. One day, you'll sit by this lake again, and no one will dare take that joy from you." A rush of plans sparked in my mind. Years of experience in finance had taught me how to spot cracks in any system, and the HOA was just another warped system run by a greedy person. Judith Crane had convinced herself that her title made her the law, but I had seen giant corporations collapse overnight from ambition alone. A homeowners association with a few hundred houses was nothing compared to the financial battles I'd been through. I knew exactly where to start, with legal documents, land use contracts, every line Judith had tried to bury beneath flowery meeting. This lake never belonged to the HOA, it was only leased, and when that lease ended, the one who held power wouldn't be the HOA, but whoever had the means to put money on the table. I narrowed my eyes at the water below, thought flashing like steel in my mind. Amara tugged on my arm and whispered, "I hate her." I looked at her without scolding. The words came straight from honest pain. I leaned down and held her close, feeling her body still trembling slightly. I knew then, this fight wasn't just between me and Judith. It was how I would protect the memory of her mother and the childhood my daughter deserved, not one marked by tears caused by an arrogant woman. I returned to the desk, opened more folders, and began taking note. In the dark, the screen's glow spilled onto the blank paper, where I wrote the first lines of a plan. Every word I put down felt like a blade carving my resolve deeper. I knew Judith Crane wouldn't stop. She would keep pushing more rule, more fine, more fear. But this time, I wasn't going to stay on defense. I was going to strike back. Outside the window, the music from the lakeside party still pulsed, but in my head, it was no longer Judith's triumphant laugh. It was the opening note of a battle she would never see coming. Have you ever met someone who made up rules just to bully others? Tell your story in the comments. That night, after Amara had fallen asleep in her small room with the soft yellow glow of the nightlight filtering through the curtain, I remained at the desk. The house sank into silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the steady spin of the ceiling fan. Outside the window, the lake reflected the pale moonlight, strangely peaceful. But inside me, there was no peace. I opened page after page of public land ownership records, eyes straining over dry rows of data, scanning zoning map, contracts, and old legal index. I wasn't searching for coincidence, I was hunting for a crack. A community like Lakeside couldn't exist without a complicated legal history, and in every complex system, there is always an oversight. I believed that the way an explorer believes in a treasure map, and after hours of sitting motionless, my hands sore, and my eyes burning from the screen's glow, I found something, a single line of text that sent my heartbeat into chaos. The Central Lake, the very symbol the HOA loved to call the heart of the community, was not owned by the HOA, contrary to what Judith had long proclaimed. It was land leased by the Lakeside Development Company from the local government, under a 30-year contract, and that term was almost up. Less than 2 months remained. That sentence appeared like the first crack in the wall of power Judith had spent years constructing. She had manipulated the community, controlled every minor behavior, citing community regulation, like an invisible blade slicing away at the lives of people like me. But who would have thought that the foundation sat on a contract about to expire? I leaned back, letting my spine sink into the chair's worn padding. A faint smile curled at my lips, not from joy, but from the irony of it all. For years, she had used the HOA as a vice to clamp down on anyone outside her safe circle. But now, the very thing she used to squeeze me, and my neighbors, might be the thing to cut her down. I had no weapons, no wealth, no connections, but I had the truth. And sometimes, the truth alone is enough to collapse an empire built on lies. The next morning, the sun rose early. I was out mowing the lawn, the blade of the machine humming steadily across the damp ground. Every push through a patch of wild grass was my way of staying calm, of steadying the fire in my chest from what I'd discovered. I didn't want to act on impulse. I needed a plan. But just then, a middle-aged man walked slowly toward the fence. He was tall, with sun-weathered skin, salt and pepper hair, wearing a pale blue short-sleeved shirt and khaki pants. His eyes were bright, but there was something firm in his gaze, as if he'd seen too much injustice but had never bowed to it. He introduced himself as Lewis, a former attorney now retired. He said he'd heard from Amara about what happened to us, and he wanted to share a few things. I invited him into the house. We sat down in the living room, everything simple, from the slightly worn gray sofa to the wooden table I had built myself. Lewis began to speak. His voice was low and steady, without bitterness, but each word carried the weight of experience. I've lived here for 12 years, and I've watched Judith Crane turn the HOA, step by step, into her personal money machine. Don't think she cares about the community, she only cares about her wallet and her power. He told me about incidents that had happened in the neighborhood, stories that seemed minor in isolation but, when connected, revealed a deliberate system of control. One family hung a flag in their front yard and was soon fined for violating aesthetic standards. An elderly woman left a wooden chair on her porch and received a safety violation notice. Eventually, after enough absurd fines, they were forced to sell their home. Those properties were quickly snapped up not by regular families, but by shell companies. According to Lewis, it all traced back to Judith. As I listened, I could feel the blood boiling through my veins. What I had once suspected, once sensed in vague intuition, was now laid bare. But Lewis wasn't finished. He lowered his voice, as if worried the neighbors might hear. I noticed something. Families of color, immigrants, and anyone outside Judith's inner circle, they're fined more than 3 times as often. I have the numbers. I've kept records, because I knew the day would come when we'd need. He placed a folder in front of me, not thick, but enough to make me sit up straight. Inside was a detailed spreadsheet, names of households, types of violations, fine amounts, with dates clearly listed. Each dry line of data, when pieced together, painted a chilling picture. Families like mine with different skin tones, different last names, fined relentlessly. Meanwhile, white households, long established, well connected to Judith, were virtually untouched. I didn't know what to say. My hands trembled, not fear, from fury. I thought of Amara's eyes that morning, the way she sat in silence after Judith's cutting words, her gaze sunken, not understanding why a simple fish was met with such contempt. I had tried to let it go, had thought we just needed to keep our heads down and live quietly, but now I understood this wasn't just a $500 fine. This was a system of discrimination disguised as community standard. This was a fight for dignity, and if I didn't stand up, it wouldn't just be me who got trampled. My daughter would grow up with the memory that her father stayed silent, bowed his head, and let injustice devour us both. Lewis looked at me, his eyes serious. He said slowly, "You're not alone. There are others like. We just need one person brave enough to stand first." I nodded, my gaze turning to the window. The lake lay still under the midday sun, its surface sparkling but stripped of. To me, it had become a battlefield where Judith and I would face each other. other. The lake's lease was about to expire. Its true ownership was still floating in limbo. Judith believed she could quietly seize it, turn it into her own project, private park, with tall fences, gleaming signs, and new rules written by her hand. But she didn't know I had already seen the first crack in that wall of power. And once there's a crack, the whole thing can fall. I would be the first to put my hand on it and push. Not because I enjoy conflict, but because I refuse to let my daughter grow up in a world where justice belongs only to those in power. And this time, Judith won't have the chance to smile over my humiliation. Ever since the morning I dared to look Judith Crane in the eye and refused to back down, a storm of fines began pouring down on my house. Not a torrential flood, creeping waves, dripping like needle prick, lingering like an itch you can't scratch. It made me feel like an invisible pair of eyes was watching our every move, every detail of my daughters and my daily life, as if the moment I stood tall, I had been locked into a shadow surveillance system unacknowledged but undeniable. The first notice arrived on an early weekday morning, just after I had dropped Amara off at school. I came home, still tasting the strong coffee in my mouth, and found a slip of paper wedged behind the doorknob. It was a citation, clearly written. The grass in my yard was over the height limit by half an inch. I stood frozen at the door, then laughed. A bitter laugh drained of patience. Grass? I had just mowed 2 days ago every blade, every edge, clean and straight. It hadn't even grown past the sole of a shoe, and yet it was over the limit? But the paper didn't stop at word. It came with a color photo, shot from outside the fence, date and time stamp. I looked around, saw no one, felt more certain than ever someone was lurking, waiting for the smallest misstep to snap the shutter, like a hunter waiting for prey to stumble. Less than 24 hours later, I received another notice. This time, it was about the trash bin. I had rolled it to the curb at the exact approved time in the early morning, placed it exactly where everyone else did, yet the fine stated trash bin improperly positioned. Another photo came with it, this time from a side angle, likely taken from a passing golf cart. The image was blurry with morning fog, but still deemed sufficient proof. I began to understand Judith didn't want to punish me once and move on. She wanted to grind me down, drive pins into the fabric of my days, wear me out until I gave up, until I understood I didn't belong here, that I should quietly bow out. It all peaked that afternoon. Amara had just come home from school, rushing inside to answer a call from a friend. She left her bicycle on the driveway, just 10 minutes, not even properly parked. When I stepped outside, I found her standing silent at the door, hands trembling as she held up another fresh notice. This time it wasn't just a warning, it was a formal citation, with a color photo of my daughter's bike, clearly labeled, "Item left out of place, violating aesthetic standard." I looked at Amara. She looked up, her eyes wet, lips pressed tight as if holding back tears. 14-year-old girl, still grieving a mother less than 2 years ago, is now photographed and punished over a bicycle. I walked over and pulled her into my arm. I felt every tremor in her small frame, each sob she tried to swallow. Her hair still carried the faint scent of the shampoo from this morning, but in my embrace, she was no longer just a carefree child. She was being forced to grow up in bitterness and humiliation. I tried to hold back the outrage, but the anger surged like waves pounding my chest. I stepped outside and looked around the neighborhood. Across the street, a white family had left their pickup truck blocking the sidewalk all night. Off in the far left corner, someone's trash bin still lay tipped over from the day before. No warnings, no photos, no citation taped to their door. I didn't need any more proof. Favoritism stood there in plain sight. The rules were being used like a whip, lashing those who didn't share the same skin color, the same background, the same safe circle Judith had built around herself. I used to think that if I kept my head down, things would pass. If I avoided conflict, Amara would have peace, but I was wrong. One evening, I walked into her room and saw her quietly gathering the violation slip, tucking them into her desk drawer like she wanted to hide them from me. I came closer, gently sat beside her, and wrapped my arms around her. She looked up at me, eyes red, trying to force a crooked smile. "It's okay, Dad. We can just let it go." I couldn't take it anymore. My tears fell not out of fear, but because I realized my daughter was learning to endure humiliation. She was growing up in a place where injustice was taught as something to silently accept. I wiped my tears, took her hand, and said, every word deliberate, "Amara, we're not running. I promise, we won't let anyone take our life from us, ever again." My voice was raw, but in my chest, a new heartbeat rose steady and resolute. From that day forward, I began carefully saving every citation, every photo, every warning. I no longer saw them as symbols of weakness or submission, but as bricks Judith herself was handing me to build her indictment. Every time a new notice came, I documented it from every angle, recorded the time and circumstance. I was preparing for the day she would have to face the full weight of the power she abused. At night, once Amara was asleep, I sat alone. The house was still, only the ticking clock and the whisper of wind in in the yard kept me company. I opened my computer, pulled up each file, and cross-checked HOA regulations against Judith's actions. I had worked in business. I understood law, I understood power structure, and now I would use that very language to the board, not for money, not pride, for dignity. Because my daughter needed to know her father didn't bow his head. And as I stared into the soft glow of the desk lamp, I added one more line to my note. This battle won't end in silence. It will end in the collapse of the one who used rules as weapons against others. I took a deep breath, listened to the pounding in my chest, then closed my eyes, and reminded myself again, we're not running. The residents' meeting was held in the small hall at the center of the neighborhood, a space usually reserved for summer festivals and community events. Today, it was packed wall to wall, the air thick with curiosity and the invisible fear Judith Crane had cultivated over the years. Amara and I walked in, clearly feeling the sideways glances aimed at us, some sympathetic, others avoiding eye contact like we were contagious. I knew they had heard about the fines, photos, the endless notices my family had received. We had become the name whispered behind hands, but still, no one spoke up. Judith stood on the wooden podium, composed, arms folded across her chest. Her voice rang out sharp and high, piercing the room without a microphone. Newcomers lowered the value of this place. The words landed like a blade driven straight into the chest. No euphemism, no pretense, just blunt force that sent the entire room off balance. I saw some people glance at me and whisper, others nodding as if conceding her point. She made sure to look directly at me when she said it. That stare was steel, accusing and daring all at once. I heard chairs shift, murmurs ripple through the room. Amara sat beside me, her small hands gripping the hem of her shirt. She knew all too well that the statement wasn't aimed at some generic newcomer, but squarely at the two of us. I took a deep breath, then stood up. I knew if I stayed seated, I'd be letting her stomp me into the ground. My voice wasn't loud, but it was firm and clear. Value isn't in skin color, it's in character. For a brief second, every whisper fell silent. I looked straight into Judith's eyes and didn't blink, and I saw the corners of her mouth. For a moment, the room froze. I could hear my own heart pounding, even Amara's soft breathing beside me. I had said what everyone knew, but no one dared to admit out loud. Those who had been unfairly fined, scrutinized for simply being different, they understood every word I said, but most of them kept their heads down, too afraid to clap, too afraid to speak, because Judith still stood there, on that platform, power hanging like a sword above every single one of them. She let out a dry, sneering laugh, gritting her teeth, full of arrogance. You'll soon learn I hold the law, not you. The room shook with the venom in her voice. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a public threat. She no longer felt the need to hide her authoritarian grip. Amara dropped her head, and I could feel her body trembling with fear. I placed a light hand on her shoulder, offered her calm with my eyes, then turned back to Judith. I could see she was reveling in this moment, savoring the act of humiliating someone under the weight of her authority. But I also caught a flicker of worry in her face, fleeting recognition that what I said had struck something in the hearts of a few people in that room. An older man seated in the back row cleared his throat, as if to speak, then stayed silent. A young woman in the corner turned to her friend, her eyes uncertain. Those small signs were enough for me to see. Judith no longer held the absolute control she thought she did. Her declaration had been too blatant, too harsh, and that rawness had shaken the wall of power she had built fear and silence. I sat back down, but the heaviness in my chest was gone. I knew I had lit a fuse. I had made a public statement. Dignity is not something to be traded fear. And I also knew, from that moment on, the battle between Judith and me was no longer hidden. It had officially erupted in front of the entire community. Judith Crane still stood there, a cold smile frozen on her lip, but behind it, I could see a fury waiting to be unleashed. I realized she wouldn't back down, and what my family would face next would be even more brutal. But that no longer made me hesitate. On the contrary, I felt the fire in my chest surge, the fire Judith had ignited herself with her own venomous words. The room slowly emptied. People left in silence, but the atmosphere had changed. A few eyes glanced at me, part fear, part admiration. Amara clung to my hand, her eyes shining, filled with both fear and a fragile flicker of hope. I gripped her small hand and whispered, I've spoken now, and we'll see this through. That night, sitting alone, I thought about Judith's final word. The law is mine, not yours. They echoed in my head, like a declaration of war. I knew that to bring her down, I had to prove that the law isn't a toy in the hands of a tyrant. The law is meant to protect fairness, and if she twisted it for personal gain, then the very crack created would become the rope tightening around her. I closed my eyes, took a long breath, and let myself feel the pain, the humiliation, and my daughter's tears. Then I opened my eyes, and for the first time, I saw the path ahead clearly, a battle for honor, with no compromise, no retreat. I would turn every one of Judith's threats into evidence, turn her arrogance into the stone that dragged her down. And I knew, after that meeting, the community had seen something for the first time. Judith Crane was not the law, she was just someone who used it to mask her greed and her prejudice. The first crack had appeared, and I would drive it wide open until the day her entire wall of false power came crashing down. After the residents' meeting, I knew I had crossed a line. Judith Crane no longer saw me as just another newcomer to punish. She now marked me as a threat to her power. And I knew, if I wanted to keep living here without letting my daughter be crushed, I had to find allies. I couldn't stand alone against a machine built on fear. Rumors spread quickly in the community. I received glances from neighbors, some probing, some cautious, but in between them were subtle nods of quiet acknowledgement. I realized not everyone bowed to Judith. Some had grown used to her rule, but others harbored silent resentment. And then, one afternoon, while I was reorganizing the garage, a man stopped at my door. His name was Harris, salt and pepper hair, thin build, eyes sharp, voice steady. He whispered, "I know what you're going through. If you're ready, I've got a few things to share." I invited him in, made a cup of tea, and in the stillness of the room, Harris began to unfold memories he had buried for years. He spoke of the time his son left a basketball in the backyard for less than an hour only for a citation to arrive. He recalled how his wife hung purple flower pots on the porch and was hit with a notice for violating the color code. He shrugged, forcing a weak smile. We kept paying, again and again, until the fines piled up and I had to sell our first house and move into a smaller one. And who bought my old place? A real estate company, under a name I didn't recognize, but I knew who was behind it. Harris's story wasn't the only one. A week later, Mrs. Martinez invited me over. Her kitchen smelled of pastries, but her voice trembled as she spoke. She had adopted 3 foster children kids who laughed and splashed in the community pool like any others. But that day, Judith showed up, claimed they were too noisy, and immediately banned them from using the pool. When Mrs. Martinez back, fines started piling up at her door. In the end, she sold her house for cheap and moved to a smaller one in a quieter area to escape the constant scrutiny. She looked at me, eyes brimming with humiliation. They made me feel like a stranger in my own home. The next came Naomi, a young woman just past 30 who had lost her husband 2 years earlier. She told me that once, Judith led an inspection team straight into her backyard, claiming it was a mosquito. Days later, Naomi received 5 citations at once. Plants too close to the wall, fence too high, improper drainage pipe, door paint, not the regulation color, and even one for an old wooden swing. Naomi sat across from me, her thin hands clasped together, her voice bitter. I paid them all, because I was scared. But I know her goal was to make me leave so she could buy this place through her company. As the 3 stories pieced themselves together, I saw a familiar pattern. They all started with petty violations, followed by humiliation, and ended with someone losing their home. I thought of the statistics Lewis had shown me. Every number pointed to one undeniable truth. Families of color, immigrants, or anyone outside Judith's circle were being targeted. She used the HOA like a blade, slicing small cuts until the blood ran dry, then scooping up the properties at rock-bottom prices. Harris opened a file he had quietly kept for years. I looked inside charts, date, names all lined up in perfect order. The numbers and words were cold, but they told a story of blood and tears. I saw the same pattern over and over: fine, pressure, forced sale, buyback. Judith had built her entire empire on injustice. I sat still, my hands clenched so tightly I could hear the bones strain. Inside, fury rose not just for myself, but for the people sitting in front of me, for Amara. My daughter would grow up one day, and I didn't want her to see her father bow his head. I didn't want the next generation to accept that the law could become a weapon of oppression in the wrong hand. I can't let this continue, I said, voice low but firm. If we stay silent, how many more families will she destroy? It's time Judith paid the price. Harris nodded, his eyes lit with fire. Mrs. Martinez bit her lip, but there was resolve in her gaze. Naomi gripped my hand and whispered, "I'm ready." In that instant, a new group was formed, no official title, no nameplates, but one shared goal: to bring down Judith Crane. We called it the Resist. The name rang like a challenge. Even if it existed only in that cramped room where we Saturday, I knew this was just the beginning. But every beginning needs a spark, and this spark had been lit by stories soaked in pain, by tears, by a rage that had been buried too long. We planned how to communicate in secret private chat groups, coded terms when needed. Harris would handle the data, Mrs. Martinez would stay connected with other families, and Naomi would help spread information when the time came. And I would be the one to stand on the front line. I knew this fight wouldn't be easy, but looking at their determined faces, I felt a burning belief. As night fell, I stepped out onto the porch and looked up at the moonlight dancing on the lake. It was still as peaceful as ever, but in my heart, it had become the symbol of a coming battle. Judith thought she had this entire community locked in fear, but she didn't see that just beneath the surface, resistance was taking root. I went back inside and found Amara asleep on the sofa, face still marked by the exhaustion of too many long days. I gently pulled a blanket over her and silently promised, "You won't cry because of her again." And in the dark, I whispered, "The battle has begun, and we will not back down." That day, The central hall was packed. The air was stifling with body heat, and a steady undercurrent of whispers rippling through the rows like an underground tide. Judith Crane had prepared everything meticulously. Every detail had been calculated not to engage with residents, but to stage a performance where she was the star, the community forum her stage, and the premium lake project her centerpiece. She made no effort to hide her plan to turn the meeting into a launchpad for expansion, using slick phrases like redefining the living space and building a refined resident identity. The project name was carefully chosen: Premium Lake, exclusive lounge for refined residents, modern, polished, and exclusionary in the most polite way. Amara and I entered under the gaze of our neighbors. Every glance carried its own meaning. Some looked at me with pity, as if they had already predicted the outcome. Others quickly lowered their head, turned away, afraid to get involved. Echoes of rumors still rang in their ears, along with the stream of violation notices that arrived at my house like clockwork. In their eyes, I was just a reckless fool who didn't know his place, someone bold enough to challenge the HOA and Judith, a moth flying straight into the flame, about to be burned alive. Judith stood tall on the wooden platform, the spotlight catching her face, a smile carefully painted, flawless. That practiced smile had silenced many before. Behind her, a large screen projected polished renderings of the lakefront redesign, a lounge with white chairs lined up in perfect order, grass trimmed to precision, trees planted in rigid rows, and in the center, a glowing gold sign for premium resident. Every detail in the graphics cut like a cold blade through my memory of peaceful mornings with Amara at the water's edge where we just wanted to fish, to breathe a little freedom in a community that now no longer welcomed us. Judith raised her hand toward the screen, her voice echoing, "We are entering a new era. The lake will no longer be just a public space. It will become the true heart of Lakeside, but a refined heart, reserved for residents who truly understand the value of this place." That sentence sent a chill down my spine. Amara sat beside me, lips pressed tight, her hand clutching the hem of my shirt. She understood. So did I. Refined, in Judith's mouth, had nothing to do with quality of life. It meant skin color, bloodline, layers of social polish masking blatant exclusion. For a moment, the room clapped weakly. A few loyal residents clapped with vigor. The rest remained silent, but that silence was twisted by Judith into agreement. Then she moved on to call for additional resident fees to fund the project, a final blow disguised as a proposal. I stood up. The sound of my chair scraping against the floor wasn't loud, but it was enough to turn heads along the row. I didn't rush. My steps were slow, deliberate, as if walking along a boundary line. My eyes never left Judith. Pause. I could see the flicker of doubt behind her gaze, but Judith forced the polite smile back into place, as if nothing could possibly threaten her position. I said nothing until I reached the edge of the table. Then I placed a stack of papers down. Thud echoed through the dead silent room. "Excuse me," I began, my voice calm, not loud, not rushed, but each word landing like a hammer on concrete. "The lake now belongs to me." A wave of sound exploded. Whispers swelled, blended into a rising murmur. Someone's jaw dropped. Another person gasped, "What?" and covered their mouth. Judith recoiled, stepping back half a step. Her face changed color instantly from shock to pale. Her eyes widened, locked on the stack of papers as if I had just placed a live bomb on the table. Inside was the legal deed ownership signed and stamped by the local government. Not some glossy printout, not a gimmick. Black ink on white paper. "Fact," she stammered. The first sounds out of her mouth were no longer commands, but a shriek forced through her throat. You went behind the HOA?" I paused just long enough for her to hear the panic in her own voice. Then I spoke, slow and sharp, each word slicing through her polished image. "From now on, residents are no longer welcome at this lake." A heavy silence dropped over the room like the air had been sucked out. Then chaos hit. Shouting, soft laughter, voices whispering across rows. "What did he just say? He owns the lake? Oh my God, is that true?" I saw Amara sitting below, her eyes wide for the first time in months. They weren't sad. Her eyes sparkled, like she was witnessing a miracle. Judith tried to regain composure, couldn't hide the tremble in her hand. She hissed through her teeth, "You can't do that. The HOA has a usage agreement we have right." I tilted my head and gave a slight smirk. "That agreement expires in less than 2 months, and the new owner has full authority. That's me. If you want to sue, go ahead. But paperwork doesn't lie." The whispers began to shift. Someone laughed out loud. Others nodded, murmuring as if they finally had a reason to stop fearing Judith. Everything she had prepared her speech, the slideshow, the lighting, the carefully staged performance, crumbled under a single stack of paper. A small quake, but enough to shake the very foundation of her power. She stood frozen, one hand still on the edge of the table, like clinging to driftwood in a storm, her face flushed with rage, then drained white with fear. And in her eyes, for the first time, I saw it clearly. She knew she had lost. I turned and walked away, past a sea of stairs. At the end of the row, Amara stood up and ran to grab my hand. Her small fingers clutched mine as if afraid I'd vanish. I held hers tighter, saying nothing, just feeling a quiet joy, a shared belief, a light cutting through all the dark days behind us. Outside, the sun had started to tilt westward, afternoon light slicing through the glass, landing directly on the deed lying on the table where Judith still stood, motionless. That beam of light was cold and sharp, like a blade exposing the stage she had built for herself. And I knew, in that moment, the tide had turned. I hadn't just reclaimed the lake, I had reclaimed a voice, a dignity stripped from me for years. If you want to see her silence, drop one word in the comments: deserve. I knew my blow in the meeting hall wasn't the end. Judith Crane was the type to cling to power until the bitter end. She wouldn't accept humiliation in front of the residents without striking back. But I also knew her authority fed on fear and silence. If I wanted to break that hold, I needed light. I needed the world to see the truth. And so that very night, while people were still buzzing over the meeting, I edited the video Amara had secretly recorded on her phone. In the video, Judith stood on the podium, her voice booming as she flaunted the upscale lake project, her elegant words laced with veiled discrimination. Then the footage jumped to me walking forward, placing the stack of papers on the table, declaring clearly, "Excuse me, the lake now belongs to me." Judith's face went pale, then flushed crimson, her lips moving in silent confusion. The final shot captured the moment. I said, slowly, "From now on, residents are no longer welcome at this lake." The room went completely still, then exploded. Amara had caught it all, uncut, unfiltered, truthful display. I uploaded the video to social media with a simple title: "Oh, tried to steal the lake. I bought it and locked them out." Within hours, the view count soared. The next morning, my phone buzzed so relentlessly that the battery couldn't keep up. People shared, commented, and roasted. What had started as a neighborhood dispute in Lakeside had now become a story. Tens of thousands were watching unfold. Then came the meme. One showed Judith's flushed face beside the wooden sign I'd posted, "Residents not welcome." The internet lost. Someone captioned it, "Karen meets final boss." Another image cut to the scene of me laying the deed on the table, with the tagline, "Plot twist the HOA didn't see coming." One after another, they spread like wildfire from local forums to major pages, mocking HOA absurdity. I scrolled through, a bittersweet smile creeping across my face. Social media can be brutal, but this time, that brutality became my weapon, exposing truth to the world. In the comment sections, outrage poured out. Someone wrote, "Finally, a bully got smacked down." Another, "She thought she was the queen of the cul-de-sac? Embarrassing." Some shared their own stories about being harassed by HOAs over fences, paint colors, even landscape. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It struck a chord with thousands who'd lived through the same. What surprised me most was the solidarity that crossed racial and class lines. One commenter said, "I'm white, and my HOA made my life hell too. I feel your pain." Another, a veteran, wrote, "We served to defend this country, only to come home and get our rights trampled by HOAs. Standing up like you did, that's how we fight back." Those comments stacked up, forming a wave. Judith became the punchline. Residents who once bowed their heads around her began to shift stance. They no longer looked at me with suspicion, but with a mix of respect and surprise. At the supermarket, a few stopped to shake my hand, whispering, "You did the right thing." I knew they were still afraid, not ready to publicly stand against Judith, but the wind had changed direction. The HOA gradually turned into a joke. Every rule they'd once enforced became a target for scrutiny. People posted photos of their trash bins with captions like, "Careful, HOA might fine you for breathing off rhythm." Another resident filmed Judith's golf cart circling the block like a sheriff's patrol, adding a goofy soundtrack. That video spread quickly too, throwing more fuel onto the fire, engulfing her image. Amara watched it all with eyes bright and wide. She laughed for the first time in months when she saw a meme of Judith photoshopped, sitting alone by the lake, captioned, "No residents allowed, except me." She turned to hug me, whispering, "Dad, people finally see who she really island." I nodded, but deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Social media might humiliate Judith, but she wasn't the kind to retreat. I had embarrassed her in front of the residents, and now made her a laughingstock online. Her retaliation would be vicious, but the outrage online was beyond her reach. Judith could control the HOA, but not the internet. The more she screamed within her little fiefdom, the more she became a symbol of absurdity for the entire world to mock. I spent the evening scrolling through hundreds of comments, reading people venting their fury and delight. They weren't just amused by a tyrant getting taken down, they found a sliver of justice for themselves. I realized my story had outgrown a local lake dispute. It had become a damning indictment of how HOAs wield power to wreck people's lives. My phone buzzed nonstop with reporters reaching out. They wanted interviews, deeper angles. I declined most of them, but inside, I felt the weight of truth's momentum. Once light shines in, darkness has nowhere left to hide. I sat beside Amara, watching her smile genuinely, freely, and I thought, this is the real victory. Not the shares, not the memes, But her smile, the one that had disappeared in the fog of tears and shame, now it was back, brought to life by truth laid bare. Late at night, I stepped onto the porch, phone still blinking with notification. The digital wave would keep spreading. Judith would surely strike back. But in that moment, I felt a deep calm. I had proven, to the world and to myself, that justice doesn't always whisper. Sometimes, it roars through a video, a meme, and the laughter of thousands. The HOA, Judith's old instrument of fear, had become a national joke, and in that laughter, I heard a message loud and clear: fake power never lasts. Judith Crane did not accept defeat in silence. I knew she would do everything in her power to drag me back to the position of the ruled, a label she imposed on anyone who dared challenge her. After the video went viral and residents began to chuckle behind her back, she reached out to powerful connections she'd long boasted about. Less than a week after the shock at the town hall, a white city inspector's car stopped in front of my house. Two men in light blue shirts stepped out, folders in hand. I opened the door. Amara stood behind me, her eyes wide with worry. One inspector nodded politely, but his gaze was sharp. We've received a complaint from the Lakeside HOA and are conducting a routine inspection of this property. I raised an eyebrow, immediately recognizing Judith's move. Routine? I haven't seen a single inspection here in 10 years, and this just happens to fall right now? The man didn't answer. He simply opened the folder and pulled out a long list of items to review. They started in the garage, pulling out a ruler to measure paint coverage. Even a faint stain on the corner wall was noted. Then they moved to the mailbox out front, eyeing it before saying flatly, "Color doesn't match the fence. Needs correction." I let out a dry laugh. This is the original box installed by the developer. It's never been changed. They nodded, but still wrote it down. In the kitchen, one of them crouched to examine the drain pipe, shaking his head. Signs of leakage. I leaned in just a damp mark from the rain, the day before. It was clear they weren't here to find the truth, but to fabricate problems. Amara stayed close, her face tense, her hands clenched. I rested a hand on her shoulder, assuring her it was all just theater. The inspection dragged on for hours. They moved from room to room, taking notes like they were auditing a crime scene. Outside, one flipped over a chair on the patio, took a photo, and said, "Incorrect placement." I asked, "Says who? Show me the regulation." The other mumbled, offered no reply, and brushed past me like he hadn't heard. I understood they weren't here to follow the law. They were here to apply pressure, to show me Judith still had the power to make things hard. But there was one thing they couldn't touch: the lake. I looked out and saw the water glittering in the late afternoon Sunday. No matter how many absurd violations they listed, the lake remained my property, legally documented and unshakable. Judith could bribe, command, and intimidate, but she couldn't reach the lake. It stood as a wall, proof that her power had limits. When the inspectors left, dropping off a thick stack of warnings for every so-called violation, I simply stood there. I didn't get angry, didn't plead. I knew the only reaction Judith wanted was panic, a desperate appeal. Instead, I calmly gathered the papers, brought them inside, placed them neatly in the box where I kept every citation. Each sheet was a brick, and I was building the case one Judith would one day have to answer to. That night, Amara sat on the sofa and asked softly, "Dad, can she make us move out?" I looked her straight in the eyes and answered firmly, "No. The more she struggles, the more it shows she's losing control. Remember this, we're the ones holding the key to the lake, and the lake is the heart of this place." Amara stayed quiet for a moment, then nodded gently. In her eyes, the fear had faded, replaced by a hint of trust. In the days that followed, word of the inspection spread. Neighbors whispered that the inspectors came to my house just to nit. Many who had once been unfairly fined by Judith immediately recognized the familiar pattern. They shook their heads and scoffed. "It's her again." Instead of reclaiming her dominance, Judith was exposing her own pettiness. People began speaking more openly at gatherings, no longer avoiding the subject like before. I noticed a shift in the eyes of those who once stood with Judith. They had concerns because clearly she had lost control over a single resident. Her desperate move of calling in city inspectors only proved her fear. The more she flailed, the more obvious it became that her power didn't come from the law, it came from the fear she instilled in others. And once that fear began to dissolve, so would the throne she sat on. One night, I sat by the lake, watching the moonlight shimmer on the water. I thought about the absurd harassment she had orchestrated, couldn't help but laugh. She once believed she was the law, but now, her abuse of it had turned her into a joke. No more authority, no more prestige, clumsy theatrics for all to see. I knew the road ahead would still be long, but I felt a growing certainty inside me. Judith Crane lost the moment she showed fear. The next day, I saw Harris again. He had heard about the inspection and shook his head. "I used to be a lawyer. I know what she's doing. The harder she pushes, the more afraid she is of you." I nodded and handed him the file the inspectors left behind. He smiled, a knowing smile. "Keep all of it. Every single sheet will be evidence not just against her, but against the ones propping her up." I understood then that Judith was clinging to her final connection, but in doing so, she exposed her weakness. The more she leveraged outside power to crush one small family, the more she revealed her own impotence, and the community saw it all. I returned home and opened the door to Amara's room. She was doing her homework, her face focused. I stepped in, placed a hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "Don't worry, things will change. This lake doesn't just belong to us, it will stand as proof that justice can defeat deceit." Amara looked up, her eyes brighter, and gave a small smile. That smile strengthened my resolve. The story isn't over. Judith Crane still has power, but that power is cracking. I could feel it like a wild animal cornered. She would grow more reckless, but each reckless move would only expose the truth. She was never the law. She was merely someone who used it to mask her cowardice. And now, that mask was shattering for everyone to see. I knew that once Judith Crane had resorted to city inspectors combing through every corner of my house, she wouldn't stop there. That desperate flailing only proved she was losing control. That was when I understood it was time to strike back with a decisive blow. Everything Harris and the other residents had handed me over the past few weeks, from absurd citations to detailed records of forced home sales, couldn't sit forever in a file box in the corner of my desk. The truth needed to be exposed to the public, where the light was strong enough to burn through the mask Judith had worn for years. We held a closed meeting in my garage. Harris brought his old laptop, which held all the data he'd saved over nearly a decade. Mrs. Martinez came with the warning letters that once scared her into selling her house, each page now carefully laminated like courtroom evidence. Naomi arrived with printed photographs, including shots of Judith sitting in her golf cart, pointing while HOA staff posted fines on front doors. Each piece seemed small on its own, but together, they formed a disturbing picture. The HOA was just a shell, and Judith pulling every string behind it. Harris typed thin fingers across the keyboard, linking the information to the county's public record. He showed me a long list of shell companies, each name sounding unfamiliar, but when traced, all led to the same small law office on the outskirts of town. On paper, those companies were buying up the homes forced into sale in Lakeside, but in reality, they were all under Judith's control. "She's not just issuing fines for money," Harris said, voice low and grim. "She's issuing them to grab land. This isn't just abuse of power, it's a coordinated scheme of acquisition." I sat in silence, staring at the glowing screen. Judith Crane's name appeared again and again across the document, like the tentacles of an octopus stretching through the entire community. I thought of Amara's tears, Harris's weary sighs, Mrs. Martinez's bitter eyes, and the tremble in Naomi's voice. Every story now had linked evidence. I knew the time for silence was over. We agreed. It had to be a powerful blow, not just within the neighborhood, but beyond, into the public eye, where both the law and media would have to pay attention. Harris had once mentored a local reporter back when he taught law. We reached out and arranged to meet at a small cafe outside town. The young reporter listened intently, taking detailed note, his expression growing more serious with each document, citation, photo, and, most critically, the list of shell companies we placed before him. He didn't sugarcoat it. "If all of this goes public, it'll blow up like a bomb." 3 days later, the article dropped. The front page of the local paper ran a bold black headline: "OA President Exploits Minorities." Beneath it, photo of Judith Crane, her face tense from a previous town meeting, eyes full of arrogance. The article detailed each case, Harris, Mrs. Martinez, and even families we hadn't known about who had also been targeted. It laid out clearly how Judith had weaponized HOA rules to corner residents into selling, then used shell companies to quietly acquire their homes. When I held the newspaper in my hands, it felt like the storm had truly begun. Amara looked at the bold headline, her eyes lighting up. "Dad, people finally see the truth." I nodded, but deep down I knew this wasn't just about being seen, it was about those who once bowed their heads finally beginning to lift, and that's exactly what happened. By that very afternoon, a wave swept across Lakeside. Residents buzzed with conversation, and many who had never dared to speak now openly admitted what they'd endured. An old man, usually silent as he trimmed his lawn, stood in the street holding the paper high and shouted, "It's time, can't let her keep going." Scattered claps followed from nearby neighbors, something that had never happened before. At the market, I overheard women whisper that Judith once harassed them for displaying holiday flags that didn't meet code. A young man in a pickup said the HOA once threatened to tow his truck parking in the wrong spot, but now he just scoffed. "Let's see how much longer she keeps this up." People began saying Judith's name not with fear, but with contempt. Judith, of course, lashed out. She sent a letter to all residents accusing the article of distorting the truth and promising to sue the paper. But instead of calming the community, the letter was photographed and posted online, becoming instant satire. Someone captioned it, "Distorting the truth? What about 20 years of bleeding people dry? Is that your truth?" The more Judith flailed, the more she exposed herself. I passed by the community hall and saw someone had pinned the article headline to the public bulletin board. That image of Judith, under the bold print, "Exploits Minorities," stood out among lost pet flyers and garage sale ads. Paused to look at it, feeling something strange stir inside. It wasn't gloating. It was relief after months of pressure and humiliation. For the first time, the truth wasn't trapped behind closed doors. It was out in the open, where everyone could see it. That evening, we met again. Harris read aloud a few comments from readers across the country, people who had never heard of Lakeside but were still outraged. One wrote, "Injustice eventually comes to light, no matter where it hides." Another said, "Judith Crane is just one example, but she represents a rotting system." Naomi's eyes welled with tears, her voice shaking. "For the first time, I don't feel alone." Amara sat beside me, her small hands gently holding mine. She smiled, not the forced, quiet smile she had worn for so long, but a real one, the kind that comes when justice begins to show its face. She whispered, "Mom would be proud of you." I didn't respond, my throat tight, but inside I felt steadier than I ever had. The counterattack had gone beyond the borders of Lakeside. It was no longer just my family's battle, it had become a community story. The cracks in Judith's wall of power had spread, whole sections collapsing under the weight of public scrutiny. I knew she would still flail, but each move now only revealed more of the truth. Late at night, I stepped out onto the porch, cool breeze blowing in from the lake. I looked at the water shimmering in the moonlight and thought of Amara's tears, of Harris's broken voice, of Martinez and Naomi's story. Now, all of it had become a collective outcry. I said quietly to myself, "This fight for dignity no longer belongs to me alone. It belongs to everyone who's ever been trampled, and we will win." The article didn't just shake the community, it reached the district attorney's office. I remember the day clearly. A government-stamped envelope arrived at our door, and inside was the official notice. An investigation would be opened into the operations of the Lakeside HOA and Judith Crane herself. I held the paper in my hand, and it felt like the weight of years of pressure suddenly burst open in my chest. Harris sat beside me, eyes shining, and whispered, "Now taste what real justice feels like." The investigation launched quickly. Families who had been forced to sell their homes came back, not with heads bowed, but walking tall into the investigator's office, ready to tell their stories. I saw an elderly couple I hadn't seen since they'd moved out quietly in the middle of the night, no one knowing where they had gone. Now they were back, holding stacks of old citations, each one still creased and worn. The husband's voice trembled. "We were pushed out because we couldn't pay the bogus fines. She drove us out to snatch the house." Then came a black woman named Charlene, who used to live near the lake. She recounted being fined thousands of dollars just for owning a dog, while others let theirs roam freely with no issue. She broke down when describing how she'd had to sell her house for cheap to a company she later learned was a front for Judith. Charlene looked the investigators in the eye, her voice shaky but strong. "We kept quiet because we were afraid. I'm not afraid anymore. I want her to pay." The evidence piled up. Harris provided spreadsheets with exact figures, laying out the disparities in fines between families of color and longtime white residents. The graph lines cut like a blade. Judith Crane had deliberately targeted those who were turning HOA rules into a tool for discrimination. Mrs. Martinez brought old warning letters, the handwriting frantic and threatening. Naomi handed the DA a folder of photographs Judith on her golf cart, pointing as HOA staff posted citations door to door, face full of contempt. I testified too. In the interview room, I laid out every detail of what had happened to my family from that morning, at the lake when Judith held up the new regulation, to the cascade of fines, to the absurd inspection of every corner of my home. I spoke of Amara's fear, of her tears when they photographed her bicycle to use as evidence. I spoke slowly, firmly. This is not about protecting a community. This is a system of oppression, and the person at the top is Judith Crane. And the district attorney nodded, writing everything down. I saw it in their eyes. This was no longer a civil dispute. This was a coordinated pattern of behavior, and it reeked of criminal intent and personal gain. As the investigation deepened, Judith Crane truly began to unravel. She showed up to meetings gaunt and rattled, no longer wearing that polished, self-assured smile. Her eyes darted around, avoiding the stares of the very people she once ruled over. Her pronouncements, once thunderous, now came out as weak, disjointed muttering. Residents no longer sat in silence. Many stood up and demanded answers, one even slamming the newspaper down on the table in front of her and shouting, "This is the truth. What do you have to say now?" Judith went pale, pressed her lips together, and hurried out of the room. Her fear was unmistakable. I watched Judith climb down from her golf cart, walking briskly, not bothering to greet a soul. In the past, whenever she appeared, residents would step aside. Now, many looked her straight in the eye, some even whispered and smirked. The throne of power she built on fear was shaking more with each passing day. News of the investigation spread across town. More articles followed, citing new witnesses. A national outlet even ran a lengthy piece analyzing the phenomenon of corrupted HOAs, using Judith Crane as her image showed up on several pages, her face no longer polished but now tied to words like fraud, discrimination, greed. She became a cautionary symbol, a name people mentioned to mock. Amara followed it all, her eyes lit with something fierce. She said, "Dad, she finally has to face it, doesn't she?" I nodded, looking at her, seeing for the first time that her gaze held calm. She understood now that justice doesn't always come late, and that her pain had not been ignored. Inside me, anger gave way to resolve. Judith had shoved my family into the shadows, but now she was the one forced into the light, forced to be judged. The years she spent using the HOA to drive people out, to snatch up property, to sow fear, were now turning into evidence against her. Every witness, every document, every photo was another cut into the skin of her fake authority. One evening, I walked by the lake with Harris. He looked at the water and said quietly, "See? The lake is still here, but she's almost gone. Justice might come late, but once it arrives, it spares no one." I said nothing, just nodded. The lake shimmered in the moonlight, but to me, it no longer symbolized shame. It had become a monument to resilience. The investigation was still unfolding, but the outcome had begun to take shape. Judith Crane no longer had a foothold, and the entire community could see it. From someone who once made people tremble, she had turned into a woman with her head down, dodging the glare of every camera. And for me, that moment was the confirmation I needed. No matter how powerful a tyrant may seem, they cannot outrun the truth once it's brought into the light. The day of the trial, the entire town descended into chaos. The red brick county courthouse, usually quiet and unassuming, became the focal point. Dozens of cars packed the lot, reporters jostled each other for position, and lakeside residents turned up in unprecedented numbers. Everyone wanted to witness the moment the woman who once sat on the HOA throne would finally answer to justice. I grasped Amara's hand tightly as we entered the lobby. Her eyes darted around, glittering with anticipation and anxiety. I bent down and whispered, "This is the day we reclaim our dignity. Remember that." Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy. To my left sat rows of residents who had been victims. Harris was there, wearing his tidy old suit, eyes sharp. Mrs. Martinez held her rosary bead, her expression tense, fiercely determined. Naomi sat beside her, gazed forward. They weren't the trembling people clutching citations anymore, they were witnesses ready to speak. Then the door swung open, and Judith Crane walked in wearing a pale gray suit, her makeup immaculate but unable to hide the fatigue in her face. Her once well-coiffed blonde hair fell limp, and her arrogant eyes now shimmered with worry. She paused as she entered, scanning the room, meeting cold, unflinching stares. The avoidance and fear were gone, placed by rage and contempt. She inhaled deeply, attempting composure, then sat at the defendant's table. The trial began. The prosecutor stood, voice sharp and unwavering as he read the indictment. Judith Crane, as HOA president, is charged with abusing her power to coerce families into selling homes under market value, racially profiling residents, using shell corporations to seize property, and committing serious financial fraud. His words slammed into the room like gavel blows. The courtroom went silent, aside from the steady click of keyboards from the reporter. I sat among the witnesses, heart raced. All those months gathering evidence, all those humiliations, Amara's tears, they were distilled into those charges. I watched Judith, trying to sit tall, her face stony, but when the prosecutor described how she used the HOA to target families of color, I saw her hand quake slightly. Then it was Judith's turn. She stood, her voice quavering. "Everything I did was for the community. I was protecting Lakeside's values and image. If anything went wrong, it was a misunderstanding." She scanned the room for agreement. None came. Instead, the room rustled with murmurs. Some shook their heads, others sneered bitterly. I was called to the witness stand. Facing the judge and the entire courtroom, I recounted from the beginning. The morning Amara and I went to the lake to fish, $5 to $100 fine slapped on us by Judith, followed by relentless citations and that absurd inspection by the city inspector. I emphasized, this was not about protecting the community. This was systemic oppression. She turned so-called standards into tools for eliminating people she disliked, especially families of color. I looked directly at Judith as I said that. She tried to interrupt, her voice rising. "You're fabricating lies. I would never discriminate." But the judge banged his gavel, calling for order. I continued, presenting evidence. The photos, Harris's spreadsheet, Mrs. Martinez's threatening letters, the images Naomi captured of Judith directing fines from her golf cart, every item projected on the large screen for all to see. Each picture, each figure struck like a blade through Judith's layers of deception. Mrs. Martinez stepped forward, her voice trembling but unwavering. "I lived in fear. I sold my house just to escape her grasp. She did not protect the community, she profited from our pain." Then Naomi recounted the backyard inspection and receiving 5 bogus fines in a week, pointing straight at Judith, voice choked, fierce. "She turned me into a stranger in my own home." Harris followed, laying his spreadsheet before the court. "This is data, not emotion. Families of color were fined 3 times more than white residents. Numbers don't lie." Judith went pale. I could see sweat beading on her brow. She tried to regain composure. "These numbers are misleading. I was predicting residents' property values. Feeble justification echoed in a courtroom already steeped in truth. A resident at the back burst into laughter. Protect values? She only protects her own wallet. Laughter rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of agreement. The prosecutor closed with icy precision. Judith Crane did not act for the community. She turned the community into a tool for discrimination and the HOA into a cash machine for herself. Now, justice will reclaim what she stole. The judge rose, voice stern. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, this court finds Judith Crane guilty of financial fraud, abuse of power, and systemic discrimination. She is hereby removed as HOA president, stripped of all assets gained through fraud, and sentenced in accordance with the law. The gavel came down final, resolute. The courtroom erupted. Some residents wept, others embraced in relief. Harris folded his hand, tears streaming. Mrs. Martinez held Naomi tight. I looked at Amara, her face beamed in radiant joy, eyes shining like never before. She hugged me and whispered, "You did it, Dad. We won." Judith collapsed into her seat, face drained of all color. From a figure once so arrogant, she had become a trembling shadow. Her vacant eyes stared at the tiled floor, hair hanging limp around her shoulders. In that moment, I saw the collapse of a false empire, every ounce of power, every trace of pride, wiped clean by the light of justice. As I stepped out of the courthouse, dozens of Lakeside residents were waiting. They clapped, some shook my hand, and others hugged Amara. An elderly man, voice choked with emotion, said, "Thank you, we're finally free of the nightmare." I nodded, answering simply, "We did this together." I just lit the first match. The sky above the courthouse was a striking blue. The breeze was cool, carrying with it the scent of freedom. I knew this wasn't the end, but it was the most decisive turning point. From that day on, Judith Crane was no longer a name people feared. She became a warning about how power, when left unchecked, corrupt. So now I ask you, what kind of sentence could ever truly deter someone like her? After the trial, all of Lakeside seemed to tremble. Houses that had long stood silent in caution now lit up with voices once kept quiet. I remember the morning after, walking Amara to school, and the neighbors who used to avoid my eyes now nodded at me first. An elderly woman who lived on the corner, once nearly forced by Judith to sell her house, but had held on with her son's help, stood in her yard and declared, "We've stayed silent in fear for too long. It's time to stop letting anyone turn us into puppets." Her words echoed down the block, and people paused, nodding with quiet emotion. From that point on, one by one, people began telling their own story. Harris organized a gathering right on the lawn, outside the old community hall. Amara and I showed up, and for the first time, I saw residents crowding together without Judith or her cronies looming nearby. People brought stacked fines, photographs capturing absurd inspections. As they raised them in their hands, their voices trembled, tears mixing with words, but below, the applause never stopped. An old man recounted being issued a warning letter by Judith for flying a flag on the 4th of July because it spoiled the aesthetic. His voice broke, but the crowd roared back in angry cheers. A middle-aged woman told how her son had been stopped by HOA staff simply because his car was too old to meet the neighborhood's standard. She covered her face and cried, but was instantly surrounded by dozens of clapping hands offering strength. One by one, the stories poured out, and I realized just how long this community had been holding its breath. Amara sat close beside me, eyes wide and glistening. She watched the adults cry, then heard the thunder of applause that followed. She whispered, "Dad, they're not scared anymore." I smiled and placed my hand on her shoulder. She was right. Fear had been shattered. No one bowed to Judith anymore because Judith had been dragged into the light, and the truth was no longer hidden. That same week, the official announcement came. The HOA was disbanded. Board members resigned en masse, some admitting they had only acted on Judith's orders and never truly supported her. False power structure that once stood above the residents collapsed overnight. The HOA Lakeside sign was taken down from the community hall. I stood and watched the heavy wooden board being removed, feeling as if an invisible chain had just fallen off my back. The atmosphere across the community changed palpably. Children played in the streets without fear of a golf cart pulling up to issue fines. Lawns were no longer measured by the inch. People planted more flowers, hung lanterns, and even hosted small front yard parties. What once seemed like simple things had become symbols of freedom. I heard the strum of a young man's guitar drifting from a porch, something Judith would have once condemned as disruptive. Adults gathered to talk again, their eyes brighter, their voices unguarded. One evening, the residents gathered around the lake, a place that had once been the center of oppression. Now, it had become a site of remembrance and victory. A long table was set with food, drinks, and soft music playing in the background. Harris stood to speak. "We stayed silent in fear for too long, allowing one woman to manipulate an entire community. But today, Lakeside is different. From now on, we won't let anyone turn the law into a whip." Applause erupted, thundering on long after night had fully fallen. Mrs. Martinez spoke next, tears running down her cheek. "I used to think I was a lone victim, but it turns out we all shared the same fate. We let fear imprison us for too long. Today, I want to say we are free." The entire crowd broke down in tears, but in those tears, I heard laugh, cheers. Naomi stepped forward, gripping the microphone, her voice trembling, full of resolve. "We've endured enough. We must learn to stand up for ourselves. The HOA is gone, but the lesson is this: never again should we hand over absolute power to anyone." Cheers erupted like thunder, mingling with the sound of waves lapping at the lake's edge. I sat quietly, taking it all in, feeling as though an earthquake had swept through Lakeside. The lake was still there, its calm surface reflecting the moonlight, but the people around it had changed. They were no longer quiet residents, enduring in silence, but individuals who had reclaimed their voice. Amara rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Dad, I feel so light." I held her close, eyes misty. Every wound we had suffered now carried meaning, because it had sparked a fire that lit the way for the entire community. The next day, I passed by the houses that had long been tied to painful memories. In front of each one, I saw small signs of change. An old man rehung the flag he'd once been forced to take down. A family opened their garage and hosted a small party with friends. A young girl rode her bike down the street without the wary eyes Amara once had. I knew the air in Lakeside had been freed. I stopped at the lake, watching the sunlight ripple across the water. Inside, I felt the difference deeply. This wasn't just my lake, it was the lake of an awakened community. Judith Crane once thought she could use it to control, to profit, to divide. But in the end, it had become a symbol of unity and freedom. In the soft breeze, I heard the echo of children's laughter, of adults talking freely. Sounds that had vanished for years under the HOA's rule now returned stronger than ever. And I knew this was the moment Lakeside began rewriting its story. This upheaval hadn't just dethroned a tyrant, it shattered the wall of fear. Proved that silence only feeds injustice, and that when people dare to speak, false power crumbles like a castle made of sand. After the verdict was delivered, Lakeside erupted. No longer were there whispered rumors over fences, no more discreet glances through drawn curtains, or hushed voices at the playground. The name Judith Crane was no longer confined to the mouths of residents or the files of prosecutors. It had made its way into the national spotlight. A textbook case of power corrupt and its brutal downfall. The press held nothing back. They dissected every move, traced each decision, peeled away every mask Judith had ever worn. A local newspaper ran a bold headline, "The Queen of Absurdity," and it wasn't meant as a joke. They detailed how Judith manipulated the HOA, turning a community organization into her personal throne, only to watch it collapse under the weight of law and defiance. From someone once deemed untouchable, she became the town's punchline, a shattered symbol rebuilt with contempt. In the days that followed, the tide of information didn't stop. One article after another, one broadcast after the next, all delving into every layer of the story. A magazine focused on social justice cases published a long-form piece titled, "The Fall of an Empire Built on Disdain and Discrimination." One line stood out. The frightening part isn't what Judith did, but how long she did it without anyone daring to speak. On television, they replayed footage of Judith standing before the court, her face pale, her gaze vacant, a stark contrast to the powerful image she once cultivated. No longer the proud HOA president, she was now a woman shrinking before reality, alone, pleaded. The news spread like wildfire. Soon after, business outlets began reporting on Judith's assets being seized. The shell companies she had used to snap up residents' homes, each property taken through calculated deceit, were now frozen, with several forced back onto the market. High-interest loans tied to her luxury lake project, the leverage she once used to tighten her grip on power, had come full circle to strangle her. Banks froze her accounts, locked her transactions, and the mansions she once flaunted at lakefront parties were now posted for sale at heavy losses. Financial regulators stepped in, traced every dollar, and the conclusion became clear. Judith had no safe harbor left. The kingdom she clutched so tightly crumbled like sand under the rain. But the most terrifying loss wasn't financial. For Judith, the deeper wound was losing her so-called friends. Those who once raised glasses with her at lakeside dinners now turned away without a word. The same people who once praised her as a brilliant leader now avoided eye contact, deleted photos, and rewrote their statement. A man once known as her right hand, always seated to her right at meeting, now calmly told reporters, "I was just following orders. I had no idea about any of that." They washed their hands, denied, and abandoned her in the rising tide of contempt, utterly alone. I heard that Judith had been evicted from the lakefront mansion she once considered her personal palace. No longer able to afford the taxes and maintenance fees, she was forced to move into a small apartment in a dull suburb, the same place she used to sneer at as the chaotic, unregulated zone. A candid photo spread quickly. Judith sitting alone on the balcony of a third-floor apartment, her hair disheveled, wearing a faded sweater, her eyes sunken as if she hadn't slept in days. The glow was gone, pride vanished, only a a woman remained, quietly staring down at the street, as if straining to hear whether anyone still mentioned her name. People called it life's justice, a form of reckoning that required no courtroom, no sentence, just time, and the memory of a community. Judith once made the residents of Lakeside live in fear. Now, she lived in that fear herself. People said that whenever Judith went to the supermarket, there were always whispers behind her. Someone would point, "There, that's the queen of absurdity." Children who didn't fully understand the story only needed to hear her name to burst into laughter, sprint past her, mimicking it as they ran. Judith kept her head down, slipping quietly out of stores. No one had to do anything cruel. It was the stares and the heavy silence of the crowd that crushed any remaining sliver of pride she had. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in Lakeside began to It was as if the community had finally shed a weight no one could quite name. No more surprise citations stuffed into mailbox. No more golf carts circling like private patrol. Those who had once tiptoed now began to exhale. I walked past Mr. Harris's house and saw him rebuilding the white wooden fence that Judith had once ordered taken down for aesthetic non-compliance. He hammered stakes into the ground, smiling at me. Finally, I get to do what I want. Mrs. Martinez replanted her vivid purple garden, and this time, no one dared disturb it. Naomi, the young woman at the end of the street, hung bright lanterns around her porch and laughed loudly. "If anyone wants to find me, they can go ask Judith if she still has the guts." Amara changed, too. She was no longer timid, no longer flinched when a stranger's car slowed near the house. She rode her bike around the lake, her hair flying in the wind, her smile blooming like summer sunflower. I sat on a bench, watching her silhouette fade into the distance, a deep sense of peace rising in me. All the pain we had endured, all the injustice we had swallowed, now meant something. Not just for me, but for my child. Not just for one family, for an entire community. I remember one afternoon, the residents gathered in the small park at the center of the neighborhood. There was no stage, no loudspeaker, just a few wooden tables, a couple of bottles of fruit juice, and the sound of laughter. Harris raised his glass. "We once let a tyrant dictate our lives, but today, we've proven that unity is stronger than fear." Applause erupted across the park, this time unmuted by any watchful eye. Even though the anger in me had cooled, I couldn't help but see Judith's downfall as a warning. She once had the chance to lead a remarkable community. She had the resources, trust, and the authority, but she used it all to divide, to hoard, to build a wall separating the chosen from the unfit. And when the final bridge was burned, all she had left was herself. That was a harsher sentence than any read aloud in court, a sentence delivered by isolation. Late that night, I sat by the lake, the water still, and reflective like a mirror. A cool breeze swept through my hair. Amara ran up and sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. She asked quietly, "Dad, what will happen to her?" I stared at the water for a long while and replied, "She'll live in the very darkness she once created, and that's the most fitting punishment." Amara nodded, saying nothing more. In the bright moonlight, the lake seemed more peaceful than ever before, but I knew it had witnessed everything. And now, it stood as a living testament to the end of a dark era. No one mourned her, no one spoke of Judith with sympathy. She remained only as a cautionary tale, a warning about unchecked power. And in every free smile from the people of Lakeside, I understood one thing clearly: the era of Judith Crane was over, forever. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight streamed through the window into the living room, a gentle light. I hadn't felt this peaceful in a long time. The months of tension with Judith Crane, the meetings thick with threat, the violation notices, the condescending stares, all of that was now behind us. I stood still for a moment, inhaling the fresh air, feeling the lightness of a weight finally lifted, as if the invisible chains that had bound Amara and me for so long had quietly fallen away. I woke my daughter with a voice softer than any other morning. Amara opened her eye, her dark brown pupils glinting in the light. A smile flashing across her face, then fading, as if she still didn't quite believe everything had truly changed. I whispered, "Today, we're going to the lake." She sprang up, her hair a tangled mess, but her eyes bright. She didn't ask which lake I knew. She understood exactly which one I meant. We brought the old fishing rod, the one my wife had like a keepsake, and the small woven basket Amara adored. She carried the basket, skipping behind me with each step. The path to the lake felt shorter now, no longer weighed down by the fear that Judith's golf cart might come charging at any moment. Instead, I heard birds chirping in the trees, wind brushing past rooftop, and children's laughter echoing from somewhere nearby. When the lake came into view, Amara paused, awestruck, as if she'd uncovered a long-buried treasure. The water shimmered in the sunlight, gentle ripples glinting as if smiling in welcome. She turned to me, beaming, her voice as clear as a bell. "The lake is ours again." Knelt beside her, looking into her eyes. In that gaze, I saw a child finally return to her childhood, no longer robbed by disdain or paper threat. I replied firmly, "No one has the right to turn joy into a crime." I said it to Amara, but I was also speaking to myself, to the past we had endured, and to the days still ahead. She grinned widely, a smile stretching across her small face. I saw that light pierce straight through the wounds I had carried. Every sacrifice, every tear, every long night spent gathering evidence, every moment holding her close when she asked, "Why do they hate us?" All of it was worth it for this. Amara's smile was the answer to every effort, every scar. We sat down at the old wooden dock, carefully guided her as she cast the bait, her hands still trembling slightly from excitement, but no longer from fear. Each ripple on the water's surface, proof of freedom. I sighed, feeling the pressure release from my chest. I closed my eyes for a few seconds, listening to the water lapping at the shore, and in that moment, I felt my life finally settle into its rightful rhythm. A few neighbors strolled by the lake too, and this time, they didn't avoid my eye. They waved, and some stopped to chat. An old man smiled warmly and called out, "You brought this lake back to us." I smiled. Deep down I knew the truth. I was only the spark brought Judith's false power crashing down was the force of a united community. Amara squealed with delight as the bobber jerked and a small fish tugged at the line. She yanked the rod and burst into laughter. That laugh brought me back to the first time I took her to the lake, back when my wife was still alive. The memory washed over me, not with pain this time, but with comfort. I looked at Amara and saw traces of her mother in every gesture. Maybe, somewhere out there, she was smiling too. After releasing the fish back into the water, Amara sat beside me, her legs swinging above the lake's surface. She asked, "Dad, now everyone can do what they want, right?" I nodded. Yes, because no one dares to stand above them anymore. Fear is gone, and when fear disappears, freedom rushes in. She nodded slowly, then leaned into my shoulder, humming a tune she'd just made up. I realized this victory wasn't just for my family, it was for every resident who had once stayed silent. Those who had been forced from their homes were now returning to share their story. Those who used to bow their heads in fear now lifted their chin. Lakeside was no longer a grim place. It had become a true community, one where people were learning to respect each other. As the sun climbed higher, Amara got up and ran around the lake, her hair dancing in the breeze, her laughter ringing out. I sat watching her, feeling a peace I hadn't known in years. I knew we still had challenges ahead, but now, at least, my daughter had her smile back, and that alone made every sacrifice worth it. In the afternoon, we brought a few snacks to the lake and sat with some neighbors. People laughed, shared old stories, and spoke without restraint. A young woman said, "Back then, I never thought I could feel this free. I was so used to living by what the HOA found acceptable. Now I feel like I can finally live." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from everyone. Amara sat listening, her eyes sparkling. I knew these moments were etching a deep lesson into her spirit. No one has the right to crush another person's dignity, and silence only feeds tyrant. I gently squeezed her small hand and whispered, "Remember, we have freedom because we chose to speak." She nodded, her eyes shimmering, as if she had just grasped a new layer of responsibility in life. As evening approached, golden light spilled across the lake, and a cool breeze swept through. Amara and I sat in silence for a long time, listening only to the water and the wind. In that quiet, I felt the breath of freedom, the kind we had paid for with tears, humiliation, and with unwavering resolve. Amara turned to me, her smile radiant, her cheeks flushed. She said softly, "I'm so happy, Dad." I wrapped my arms around her and replied, "Your smile is the proof of everything. Every sacrifice was worth it." In that moment, I understood that our fight had never been just to bring Judith down. It had been to reclaim the simplest things, a peaceful morning by the lake, a child's pure laughter, and the belief that justice still lived. I had spent many nights thinking about how to end this fight, not just with reason and law, but with a final exclamation point, a punch strong enough to smash the last remnants of abuse. The trial was over. Judith Crane's name struck from every official document, every HOA title stripped. Privileges she once held now, nothing more than dust in community records. And yet, I felt empty. This victory didn't satisfy me. It was just, but not deep enough. I needed an image, a closing moment, something no one could ignore, something that would ensure this story was never retold without its ending. I wanted a final cut, not out of vengeance, but to carve into the public memory that abuse, even when wrapped in politeness, must never be forgiven. I chose a large wooden board so big and heavy I had to rent a pickup truck to bring it home. With my own hands, I sanded every surface, painted the background white like a blank page, then dipped a wide brush in red paint, and wrote the words one by one. I wrote slowly, not missing a stroke. Every brush stroke was a blade through memory, a slap against the ghost Judith pressed into my family's life. When the final letter came into view, I stepped back, my heart pounding like I'd just climbed a steep mountain. Against the pure white background, 4 letters blazed red, "Residents not welcome." The day I put up the sign, word spread like wildfire. By late afternoon, residents from across the neighborhood had gathered at the lake. Some wore baseball caps, others brought dogs, and a few arrived with their whole family. No one shouted, but everyone whispered, murmured. Someone laughed, then quickly covered their mouth as if caught being happy. Others frowned, clearly disapproving. yet unable to look away from the sign. The residents who had once defended Judith clustered in small group, trying to keep their faces neutral, but their eyes kept flicking to the red letters, as if hypnotized. I stood there beside the board, Amara clutching my hand. Her palm was warm and trembling not from fear, but from emotion. She looked up and whispered, "Dad, will they understand?" I squeezed her hand and nodded. "This sign isn't really to keep them out. It's not aimed at the people, it's aimed at the abuse that once made us live in fear. It's there so they won't forget." She said nothing more, just smiled softly, as if for the first time she truly believed her father had reclaimed justice. In the chaos of that crowd, I spotted a familiar figure standing silent. Judith Crane. No designer dress, no high heels, no perfectly styled hair. She blended into the crowd, trying to disappear, but there was no escaping the stares. Her face was pale like over-applied powder, her eyes glazed, stripped of any former sharpness. One hand gripped the hem of her shirt like someone about to fall with nothing to hold on to. I saw her lips trembling, not with rage, but with something closer to panic, a stunned confusion at seeing her once untouchable image of power turned inside out in broad daylight. I stepped forward in front of the board, turned to face the crowd. Every eye was on me. No microphone, no speaker system my voice carried on its own. This is the price of abuse. No immediate response, only a silence as frozen as the lake itself. Then came a single clap, isolated, but soon spreading like fire through dry grass. Someone shouted, "Yes, this is the lesson she'll never forget." Some nodded, others frowned, whispering that maybe this went too far. But I knew those mixed reactions were necessary. A real act will always divide. A memorable counterstrike never leaves people indifferent. It either makes them tremble with satisfaction or flush with anger. And both will remember it far longer than any moral speech. Judith was still standing there, as if frozen beneath the stares of the very community that had once been her private stage. As the applause grew louder, she slowly turned away, retreating step by step from the crowd. No one stopped her. No one reached out. The once proud back is now hunched, shrinking into the distance, like a fading ghost. No insults were needed. No shouting. The silence of everyone around her was the greatest humiliation she had ever known. Amara watched her go, eyes glistening. She whispered, "Dad, I think I'll never forget this moment." I looked down at her and replied softly, "Me neither. Not just because of the victory, but because my daughter finally saw what she once doubted, that justice isn't a distant dream, and the wicked don't always get away without consequence." In the days that followed, the board became a symbol. People still came to the lake, but instead of just strolling or fishing, they stood before the sign, pointing, taking pictures, talking. A group of local teenagers even printed the board's image on t-shirts as a statement against the HOA. Residents from nearby communities came just to see the thing everyone was talking about. That board became a tangible reminder that justice doesn't always come from courtrooms. It can come from a piece of wood, a few words, and someone unafraid to speak. I know some still think I was too harsh, that it's over, and I should let it go. But I have no regret. Without leaving a mark, who would remember in a few years what Judith did? Who would recall Amara's tears, Harris's humiliation, Mrs. Martinez's quiet endurance, Naomi's whispered fears? That board is a warning, a headstone for counterfeit power, so that the next generation remembers, not to remember me, to remember there was once an abuser, and someone who dared to stop her. That evening, when the lake was quiet again, I took Amara back. The moon hung over the water, its gentle light illuminating the board. The red letters shimmered on the lake's surface, as if the message had merged into the flow of this. I stood there for a long time, then quietly said, "You see, sometimes justice isn't in a verdict, truth etched into everyday life. That's what people remember." Amara nodded, her eyes bright, her smile lighter than the moonlight. One weekend afternoon, as the sun still lingered on the red brick rooftop and the sound of children playing echoed through the winding streets of the neighborhood, the residents of Lakeside gathered in full on the wide lawn near the old community hall. This was once the symbol of Judith Crane's counterfeit authority, the place where she manipulated every meeting, issued absurd regulations, and imposed her rule over the community under the guise of democracy. But today, there was no chairperson's seat, no lowered eyes flinching at her entrance. The atmosphere had changed, felt lighter, but not scattered, peaceful, yet humming with a current and undercurrent of quiet, fierce resolve rising within each person present. I stood before that crowd, hundreds of faces across all ages. There were elderly men with canes, young people wearing t-shirts printed with "Lakeside for All," families with small children sitting on picnic blankets spread across the grass. Everyone waited in silence. I took a deep breath, my chest heavy with the months of frustration swelling into a wave. Then I spoke, loud and clear without a microphone. "Silence in the face of injustice is complicity." The short sentence fell into the air like stones cast onto a still lake, rippling outward across the entire field. There was no need to say much more. Everyone here had witnessed, had understood, had lived it. It was their silence, our compromise, those seemingly harmless lowered heads of the past that had fed the monster called Judith. If someone had dared to speak up back then, maybe she wouldn't have held on to power for so many years. But no one did. did, and we paid the price. That price was fear. It was the erosion of dignity. It was children crying in the morning just for sitting in the wrong spot in their own neighborhood. In that moment of stillness, I saw an elderly man with silver hair and beard sitting in the front row nod slowly. His eyes lit up not with anger, but something closer to late-blooming clarity. He spoke softly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "We've been afraid for too long." That sentence caught like fire to dry straw. A wave of emotion swept the lawn. Young people teared up. A few elders bowed their heads and wiped their eyes. A woman stood and said that for years she never dared hang a flag on her porch for fear of violating Judith's aesthetic standard. A young man admitted he once saw a neighbor wrongly fined, turned away, unwilling to risk conflict. Then someone else spoke, and another still. Confession, once buried memories, poured forth without end. No one held back now. No one feared the judgmental glance. Harris stood beside me, leaning on his cane, his back stooped but his voice booming like thunder. "The most precious thing a person owns isn't a house, isn't land, dignity, and we let her trample that dignity. But starting today, we must vow never again." A round of applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger, spreading like waves crashing onto shore, echoing across the lake where the water shimmered under the fading afternoon light. I looked around and saw even those who once stood with Judith now bowing their head. They didn't say sorry, but their eyes had changed, no longer proud, but remorseful. I continued, my voice lower. "We've learned a costly lesson that justice isn't some distant thing. It begins with the courage to speak. If each of us stays silent, no court in the world can save us. Not because the law is weak, but because the people chose silence. The strength of a community lies in its own voice." I saw hands clasp tighter, eyes shine brighter, especially among the young. Maybe they had never been fined, never been judged for having a name that didn't sound American enough, but they were witnessing a lesson handed down through lived experience. A new consensus was forming, not through thick bylaws or binding clauses, but through quiet nod, through promises that needed no signature. The elderly nodded, as if laying down years of silent burden. The youth held hands, ready to carry the torch. There were no lines drawn between native and newcomer, no divide between long-timers and recent arrivals. What they shared now was a collective memory of being suffocated, and now, standing together to breathe freely again. I looked at Amara, sitting in the front row, eyes shimmering. She was the reason I stood here, the living proof today's lesson. I had fought so my daughter could laugh by the lake without feeling guilty, but deeper than that, so she would understand this. Silence in the face of injustice is complicity. I leaned in and spoke softly, like a vow. "Tomorrow, if someone else stands up, you must speak. Don't let anyone believe that silence means acceptance." Amara nodded, lips pressed tight, as if carving every word into her heart. After the gathering, no one left in a hurry. They lingered, forming small groups, talking, sharing things they once only dared whisper in their kitchens. Some laughed out loud, some cried openly, but all looked lighter. I overheard a group of young people talking about forming a new council, not an HOA, but a resident committee, where every decision would be made openly, transparently, and every voice would count. An elderly woman spoke up. "We need to learn how to keep watch over each other, so there'll never be another Judith." No one disagreed, only firm, steady nods. That night, Amara and I walked around the lake. A soft breeze carried laughter still echoing from afar. She held my hand and asked, "Dad, what really is justice?" I stopped, looked at the moonlit water, and replied, "Justice is when you get to sit here, laughing, and no one has the right to turn that laugh into a crime. It's when people live upright, not bowing in fear of anyone." Amara smiled. In the gentle moonlight, her smile lifted the weight from my heart. I knew this lesson would stay with her forever, not just with Amara, but with all of Lakeside. They had learned that silence comes at a steep price, that justice isn't distant, it begins with a single voice, and that unity, when it's real, is stronger than any form of manufactured power. I still remember clearly that first morning after everything had settled. I stood by the lake, watching the still water, suddenly realizing that my responsibility no longer rested solely with my family. The lake wasn't just something I bought to spite Judith Crane, it had become a symbol of change, a place where the whole community pinned their hopes for a new beginning. I told myself, if the lake remained only a relic of conflict, it would be no different than a scar that reminded everyone of pain. It needed to be reborn, to become a gathering place, where people could reclaim the peace and joy they had once been robbed of. I brought it up with Harris and a few residents. Everyone agreed the lake should be open for community events, but under rules of fairness and transparency, where no one stood above the rest. "If we start granting privileges again," Harris said, "then we're no different from the Judith day." I nodded, affirming that the only rule would be, no more privileges, everyone equal. The first event held was a spring picnic. People brought folding chairs, food, guitar music played by the water, kids ran around, young people sang, and the adults chatted. I walked through it all, seeing faces once shadowed by worry now glowing in the Sunday mist. Martinez brought pastries, smiling gently as the children scrambled to grab. Naomi set up a booth for everyone to sign a declaration. The lake belonged to the community, no one individual could ever claim it. it. When the final name was signed, applause broke out like a collective vow that Lakeside had turned the page. Amara was running with her friends, hair flying, her smile clear as glass. I sat in the shade, watching her, feeling an immense relief. She had lived through months of tears and fear, and now she was learning how to enjoy the freedom she deserved. I quietly said to Harris, who sat beside me, "Her smile alone makes every sacrifice worth it." He nodded, eyes glistening with emotion. In the weeks that followed, the lake was constantly in use. Morning yoga classes, weekend book fairs, small family gatherings. What made me proud wasn't how many events were held, but how the residents treated each other. There were no more divisions by skin color or background, no more suspicious glances to see who fit the standard. White and non-white residents sat side by side, sharing food, laughing together. Children of all races gathered on shared mats, innocently reading books. One day, a couple who had just moved in hosted a birthday party for their child by the lake. They sent invitations to every neighbor, no exception. When the child blew out the candles, cheers rang out, blending with the sound of waves. I stood at a distance, watching the scene, and felt my eyes blur. This was the image Judith had tried so hard to erase, but in the end, it had come to life more vividly than ever. I also received invitations from nearby schools. They wanted to bring students to the lake to learn about the environment and community. I agreed immediately, because I wanted the next generation to understand that the lake wasn't just a beautiful landscape, but a living testament to a lesson. Unity can overthrow injustice. On the first day the children arrived, I told them the story of the lake, not with bitterness, but with sincerity. I said, "You see a peaceful lake, but this peace came at the cost of tears. Justice never arrives on its own. It comes when someone dares to speak up." And Amara stood beside me, listening to every word, her eyes full of pride. I knew she was beginning to understand that our family's victory wasn't just about freeing a community, it was about planting seeds for the future. In the evenings, after the residents had gone home, I often stayed behind at the lake, watching the moonlight ripple on the surface. I no longer saw it as a trophy. It was proof truth and justice can be reclaimed, that pain can become strength, and that silence is no longer an option. I thought of my wife, thought that if she were still alive, she would surely be smiling to see Amara laughing freely beside this lake. Revival isn't just about fixing the landscape or hosting events. Revival is when a community that once trembled in fear learns how to stand tall, hold its head high, and look one another in the eye with respect. And I knew, from the day the "Residents Not Welcome" sign was raised like a final sentence against Judith, the lake had ceased to be a tool of oppression and had become the witness to Lakeside's growth. I closed my eyes and took a long breath. The air of freedom filled my chest, and I smiled. I knew that from now on, the lake would remain the heart of this place, not the heart of fear, but of life. It had truly been reborn. As the lake returned to its true nature, the people of Lakeside began to rediscover something they had long forgotten, the real meaning of the word community. No more tense meetings filled with domineering voices. No more absurd fines coldly to front doors. In their place were neighbors sharing dinner at dusk, laughter echoing from porches, children playing freely. People looked at one another and realized they had always needed each other. They'd just been driven apart by the hand of a tyrant. I saw that change clearly in the smallest of details. One morning, I walked around the lake and saw Mrs. Martinez sitting on a wooden bench with a young woman who had recently moved in. The two were chatting animatedly. Mrs. Martinez, who used to be timid, always looking down, now spoke with confidence, recounting the days she was wrongly fined without the slightest tremble. The new resident laughed and said she felt safe knowing Lakeside no longer had an HOA. That moment made me realize the greatest change didn't come from courtrooms or headlines, but from the simple reconnection of people who had finally found their way back to each other. Harris was more enthusiastic than ever. He proposed forming a group called Neighbors for Neighbors, so that whenever someone faced hardship, there would be others ready to help. If someone needed their roof fixed, neighbors would show up. If a family threw a small party, the whole street would pitch in. These seemingly small acts began to restore the trust Judith had once shattered. Naomi grew stronger. Too, she organized a workshop on residents' rights, reminding everyone that silence in the face of injustice is an invitation for evil. Young people showed up in large numbers, all paying attention because they had witnessed the living truth right within their own community. I brought Amara with me to those meetings. She sat attentively, occasionally asking a question that made the whole room laugh. But I knew she was absorbing an important lesson, that a community only has strength when people are willing to stand side by side, speak right, and protect one another. Watching her grow more confident, no longer afraid like before, I saw clearly the worth of everything I had fought for. The people of Lakeside began reviving activities that had once disappeared. They organized a small weekend market by the lake, where anyone could bring things to sell or trade. Some days, the smell of baked goods drifted across the grass, mixed with the sound of a guitar. People who used to be strangers now greeted each other and chatted like old friends. The story of Judith still surfaced now and and then, but no longer in fear and sarcasm and laughter. She thought she could buy this whole community. In the end, she lost everything. No one mentioned the HOA with reverence anymore. That name now existed only as a shadow, a bitter memory. But from its downfall, a stronger spirit of unity had been awakened. People realized they didn't need a tyrannical board to dictate their lives. They only needed to listen to one another and live with fairness. One evening, when the community gathered by the lake to celebrate the summer festival, I stood watching the crowd. The air was filled with laughter and conversation. Lights glimmered across the water, children ran in circles, and adults raised their glasses in cheer. In that scene, it became clear to me. The HOA was gone, but more importantly, the spirit of togetherness had returned. It didn't come from rigid bylaws, but from the belief that every person matters and deserves respect. I held Amara's hand and heard her whisper, "Dad, now this place really feels like home." I smiled and nodded gently, because I knew too that Lakeside had come back to life, not because of the existence of any organization, but because of the hearts of people who dared to stand up and live the true meaning of the word community. That morning, Amara and I returned to the lake, bringing the old fishing rod and the familiar bamboo basket. The surface was still, reflecting the clear blue sky like a mirror. I planted the rod in the ground and sat quietly, watching the ripples expand from the bobber. Amara sat close beside me, her legs dangling, face lit up in the morning sunday. The peaceful scene made it feel as if there had never been storms, never been the stacks of violation notices or the heated confrontation. But the memories came rushing back as I looked down at the water. I remembered that first morning I brought Amara here, hoping to find some calm after our losses, only to be met with humiliation when Judith Crane held up that citation. I remembered the nights I held my daughter through tears, vowing not to run. I remembered every step of preparation, every secret meeting with Harris, Mrs. Martinez, and Naomi, every carefully gathered piece of evidence to expose the truth. I remembered stepping onto the witness stand, looking Judith in the eye, and telling her she had turned a community into a tool of discrimination. It all felt like a distant dream now, but one that left marks that would never fade. Amara rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "Dad, it feels like we live in a new place, completely different from before." I nodded slightly. "It is, but not because this place changed. It's because we found our voice again. That's what changed everything." She stayed silent for a moment, then gave a quiet smile. That smile made every sacrifice worth it, because my daughter had finally learned how to hold her head high. I looked around and saw other residents walking along the lake. Some who once suffered in silence now chatted openly. New families camped and grilled without fear of being photographed and fined. Children of all backgrounds played together, their laughter echoing. And in that, I realized, this victory didn't just close the door on a dark era, it opened a new chapter for Lakeside. I thought about Judith. She was now just a shadow, reduced to bitter nicknames in the press, living in solitude and shame. At times, I wondered whether the "residents not welcome" sign had been necessary. But then I understood it wasn't about revenge. It was a reminder that silence has a cost. Without that reminder, the past could return, and people might once again bow to a new tyrant. Amara tugged at my sleeve, her voice clear. "Dad, when I grow up, tell this story to my kids so they know never to let anyone take justice away." I smiled, squeezed her hand, and whispered, "That's what I hoped for most." We sat a while longer, watching the bobber sway in the wind. I no longer felt the tension of before. No more strategizing, no more fear. In its place was peace. The journey from humiliation to justice had taught me one thing. Justice isn't distant. It begins when someone dares to speak, dares to stand up, and more than anything, dares to protect what's theirs. As the sun climbed high, I reeled in the fishing rod, placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, and said, "Remember, this freedom didn't arrive on its own. It came from tears, from patience, and from courage. Injustice may return, but as long as we don't stay silent, it will never win." Amara nodded, her eyes bright, with a light that felt like she had just etched a vow into her heart. I stood up, casting one last glance at the lake before leaving. A soft breeze stirred the water, gentle ripples spreading, and within me rose a quiet certainty. This journey had come to a close, but it had also opened a new path, one where the community understood it could protect one another, where the next generation would know how to guard their freedom. And for me, the most important part was that Amara could finally smile, a smile that was the truest form of victory. The wind rustled again, brushing across the lake, and scattering shimmering waves beneath the midday sunday. I sat quietly beside Amara, heart lighter than it had been in months, like I had finally set down an enormous burden. She tilted her head, her shining eyes watching me, waiting for a word to hold on to. I leaned closer and whispered, as much to myself as to her, "Justice isn't far away. It lives in how we choose to stand." Amara didn't speak, just smiled softly. Her smile was pure, innocent, and proud all at once. The sunlight lit up her face, casting a gentle glow across her smooth brown hair. The lake before us no longer held sorrow or shame. It had become something else entirely, a symbol of justice, a reminder that unity and courage can shatter any chain. I looked around and saw neighbors walking the shoreline, friends chatting, small families gathered by the water. They laughed as if the lake had never been used as a weapon of control. Children played, their laughter ringing clear and far. And I knew that from this day on, this place would hold a new meaning. It wouldn't just be a spot for picnics or fishing, it would quietly remind us all. Never let silence nourish injustice. Amara gripped my hand tightly and said, her voice small but firm, "I'll remember what you said, Dad. When I see something wrong, I'll stand up." I looked at her, eyes full of pride. In that smile, I saw the future, a new generation, no longer afraid, ready to defend what's right. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, like a mirror reflecting past and present. The past reminded me of days lived under oppression, and the present gave me faith that every sacrifice had mattered. I squeezed Amara's hand and nodded gently. This story had come to a close, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where the people of Lakeside knew how to live free, and where my daughter would grow up believing that justice is real, embedded in every step we take. As Amara and I sat by the lake, sunlight spilling across the surface, I knew this story had ended in a way no one could have predicted. From one peaceful morning to days of pressure and punishment, from absurd citations to hostile meetings, everything had brought Lakeside through a brutal journey to reclaim dignity and fairness. Looking back, I saw meaning in every step, because it hadn't just protected my family, it had awakened the power in a people who had stayed silent for far too long. The most haunting part of that journey wasn't the constant scrutiny over every minor detail, but the prolonged silence of everyone around us. When Judith Crane wielded her power, the residents knew injustice was present, yet fear made them bow their heads. That silence fed an irrational queen, turning the HOA into a tool of oppression. I realized that injustice doesn't grow on its own, it grows when too many eyes see it but no lips speak. And then, one day, that silence shattered, and the voices that had long been stifled erupt all at once, leaving the tyrant with nowhere to stand. In that process, I learned the true strength of solidarity. Had I stood alone, I would have collapsed under the weight of relentless harassment. But when Harris, Mrs. Martinez, Naomi, and so many other families dared to sit together, to share tear-filled stories, we sparked a flame. That flame, small at first, spread fast, growing into a force that compelled prosecutors and courts to take action. A once fragmented community found its common voice, and that shift was the turning point that brought Judith down. When the trial unfolded, truth didn't just strip Judith of her power, it gave residents, for the first time, a clear view of their own dignity. They clapped, they cried, not because I had won or she had lost, but because they saw that justice exists the moment they choose to speak. In that instant, Lakeside ceased to be a land of fear and became a symbol of resistance. But the real victory wasn't in the verdicts. The real victory came afterward. Children playing freely, adults daring to hang flags, to sing, to invite neighbors for backyard meals without fear of being photographed and fined. Each small act proved that freedom had returned. Amara, once terrified every time she heard the sound of a golf cart, now runs around the lake, laughing with her friends. To me, that laugh is the greatest reward of the entire journey. I also knew a powerful symbol had to be etched deep to never be forgotten. The wooden sign I planted, "Residents Not Welcome," was the crystallization of pain and defiance. It wasn't meant to exclude the people, but to remind them of a time when dignity was trampled, and that injustice always comes with a price. The sign became a warning, ensuring no one would ever again ignore the early signs of oppression. From that point, the community came alive. For the first time, people truly understood community meant not obeying the commands of an imposed board, but choosing to live with fairness and equality. The HOA disappeared, but the spirit of unity surged stronger than ever. Every gathering, every lakeside event stood as proof that this new bond was built on trust, not fear. As I sat fishing with Amara, I reminded myself that this journey didn't just restore a lake, it left behind a lesson. Justice isn't distant. It lives in the courage to stand, to speak up for what's right, and to defend our dignity. I whispered those words to Amara, and I believe she'll carry them always, so that one day she can pass them down to the next generation. This story ends with the image of a still lake, sunlight pouring down, and Amara's smile shining like a new beginning. But at the same time, it opens a question for all of us. Do we have the courage to speak up when injustice stands right before our eyes? The answer lies within each heart. If we choose silence, we will raise new Judith. But if we choose to speak, to stand together, justice will no longer feel out of reach. And that is the final lesson I want to leave behind. Justice is not a miracle that falls from the sky. It is the result of courage and unity. Remember that, because any community can be reborn, so long as the people within it refuse to live forever in silence.